Okay, so let me introduce myself. My name is Filizia Silcoy. I'm an assistant professor in the department. I am the one whose name keeps randomly showing up in the slides. Okay, so next in our program, we have Pathway from Research to Industry, and we have two excellent faculty members with us today. They are not only amazing mentors, scientists, researchers, but at the same time, very successful entrepreneurs. So first in our list, we have Professor Justin Williams, who is a Wallace Distinguished Professor of Neurological Surgery and the Harvey D. Spengler Professor of Biomedical Engineering at UW-Madison. Justin is renowned for his pioneering work in neuronal engineering, particularly in developing novel, minimally invasive electrodes and brain-computer interfaces. He has co-founded 4 companies focused on brain recording and treating neurological diseases, including Neuro1, which emerged from his early patent work on flexible thin film electrode technology. And notably, very recently in 2022, he celebrated Neuro1's IPO and FDA approval by ringing the NASDAQ closing bell. So that was great. And we also have Professor Dave Beebe, who is a John D. MacArthur Professor, the Claude Bernard Professor of Biomedical Engineering. He also has appointments in the Department of Pathology and Laboratory Medicine and UW, and also in the BME department. So from 2012 to 2017, Dave co-led the Tumor Microenvironment Program in the University of Wisconsin Carbon Cancer Center. He was a founding scientific editor of Integrative Biology. Dave's current research interests center on the understanding and application of microscale physical phenomena to understand cancer biology, improve cancer diagnosis and monitoring, and advance global disease diagnostics. His migration to more biological-focused research was facilitated by a 5-year NIH retraining award in cancer biology. He has published more than 350 archive journal articles, many citations, and he has also co-founded several biotechnology companies. So with this, I would like to give the floor to you.
All right, thanks, Feliz. It's really a pleasure to get up here and talk about some of the things that we've done to push these technologies into real impact, because that's really what I wanted to do when I started. So luckily, I don't have to explain what I do for a living, because Hollywood does a really good job at doing it for me. So I grew up with the $6 Million Man, watching that with my dad. So when I have to describe this to people his age, I say, well, we're making the $6 Million Man. Thankfully, Mark Wahlberg is rebooting that next summer with a $6 Billion Man, because that's a little more appropriate. So I really got inspired, though, watching Star Wars as a kid. And I did go to all the Star Wars movies in the theater. So I'm from that age. And thankfully, Star Wars keeps going, so now my kids still understand it when I say, well, what I really do is I try to make the Luke arm. I'm trying to do is somebody loses their arm, we're going to give you a new arm, it's going to work better, it's going to feel just like that. Anyway, there's a lot of different kind of analogies here, including, my kids watch DC Comics, the Cyborg, giving people new vision. But ultimately, what we're trying to do is what they did in the Matrix. We're trying to tap into the nervous system and either read or write information in there to try to treat neurological disease. All right, and I apologize. I'm a little hoarse. I've been telling John Webster stories all morning, so I'll hopefully get through this. So I put a timeline up here because I kind of take after Willis a little bit. I wander quite a bit, so this hopefully will keep me on track. But more importantly, one of the things I wanted to take away from this today was that, in my journey through academia, through starting companies, that timing is everything. So I kind of wanted to highlight some time points here that were really instrumental in getting from where I grew up on a farm in South Dakota, went to South Dakota State, go Jackrabbits, if you're an NCAA basketball fan. Ended up thinking I was just going to be a mechanical engineer. I worked for Daktronics for a year, the big scoreboard manufacturer. Anyone ever, all the scoreboards that you've probably ever seen, or have a little D in the corner. But I ended up hating it and trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life, and took a Christmas break trip to visit a friend who was going to Arizona State University. And I'm walking down the hall, he was a civil engineer, and all of a sudden we went to a little tour of the campus with him, and I see this sign that says, "Welcome to the Department of Biomedical Engineering." And I was like, what is that? And part of my timing thing here is I've always been, of the nature is that timing is everything, and you have to be ready for things that happen. So I walked into this door, and a guy named Eric Gilboa, the department chair, I was like, "Hey, what is biomedical engineering?" He said, "Oh, here." And he handed me this pamphlet, and then he handed me this thing to fill out. So I filled it out because that's what I thought I should do. And a month later, he's like, "Hey, we really enjoyed your application to graduate school." And I was like, "We'd like to fly you down to take a look." So I flew down there. It happened to, flew out of a snowstorm in South Dakota and landed in 85 degrees in Arizona, and I thought, this is what I should do. Absolutely. It's going to be a biomedical engineer, be a biomechanics person. Turns out, as things go, the advisor I was going to work with left the university after tenure. Luckily, there was this new guy, Daryl Kipke, who was going to try to make this new prosthetic arm, and so I got excited about that. I was just going to do my master's degree. I took some business classes. I was, going to go and work for Medtronic or something, and then all of a sudden, 4 or 5 years later, he's like, you could get your PhD if you stayed another year or two. So, as we say, the rest is history. I ended up going to Michigan. Arizona was too hot for me, and was there a couple years doing a fellowship with Dave Anderson, a UW grad. So he had kind of extolled the virtues of the University of Wisconsin to me. And then by chance, I met a neurosurgeon who also was at Wisconsin. We were trying to do this clinical trial, and he said, "Hey, we have some patients that you might work with." So I was actually ended up traveling to Wisconsin, and then ended up meeting this guy named Dave Beebe. I don't know if you know him. He was given a talk at Michigan, and he said, "Hey, we're starting this new BME department. You should come give a talk." So I came and gave a talk, and as things go, after the talk, ran into Rob Radwin, and he says, "Hey, could you send me your CV?" And I said, "Oh, sure." And like I say, a month later, he's like, "Hey, we'd like to have you come out for an interview." And I was like, "An interview for what?" And so as things go, I said, "That sounds like fun," and kept going. All right, so that's kind of how I ended up here. I'm supposed to talk about my companies, though. So let's, so I think I've got, 6 up here timeline. I want to point out a couple because, again, timing is everything. So we'll start with BRL. That was my miserable failure. Knew nothing about this. Wrong time, wrong place, wrong market, wrong people, right? So there's some themes I'm going to get around, right? Timing. So thankfully, we failed that one quickly. Realized we didn't know what we were doing, but we learned a lot. At the same time, I was involved in neural intervention technologies, which was a company out of Michigan that had a little bit of stake in. And that was, on paper, a huge success, right? 2 years later, after starting it, we get acquired by W.L. Gore, okay? And the timing there is actually really crucial, too, because that deal went through about a week before I got married. So, huge success, because my wife was like, "Yeah, you should keep doing this. That was really great, right? You should start more companies." To me, though, it was a failure because a year after they acquired us, they benched our technology. It turns out they never were going to do anything with it anyway. They had a competing technology and totally shelved it, and it's never seen the light of day. And so to me, that was a little bittersweet because what I wanted to do was to help people. So anyway, along the way, we also started this company called NeuroNexus, another success that was acquired by Great Batch in 2012. And I didn't have a huge part of NeuroNexus, but this is the part where we talk about timing and people. A number of years later, they also decided to shelf that technology, that it wasn't in their strategic plan and they were going to shelf it. So the guys that I met from NIT, we got together and we bought it back for 10 cents on a dollar. So now this is a great, thriving company. We've redirected, gotten back to our, by owning the company, we got back to our core mission, which was to service people in the research industry. All right, so a couple other technologies, real quick. So the ones I'm going to talk about today, though, are Neuro1, which is, has been a great journey, a long one, right? 2005, somewhere around there. It took a long time for that to get off the ground. And then our most recent one, BrainSync. Both of those, the impetus for this started at the same time. One took a long time, the other one came about kind of quickly. So Neuro1, here the idea, is keeping it simple, right? Sometimes less is more. As an engineer, we sometimes get things kind of complicated. We really want to overcomplicate things, right? Make it the latest, greatest. And this was find the simplest solution for this problem. So NeuroOne is an epilepsy company. When I was a first faculty member, I actually took the impetus. I spent every Tuesday and Thursday morning in the OR. I'd met some neurosurgeons here, and I just followed them around, and they were happy to, and we would bounce ideas off. So one of the things we were interested in was epilepsy surgery. So epilepsy surgery at that time was a pretty barbaric procedure. You can see, this is one of our patients. You can see you get this big horseshoe type of incision, open up, take a big chunk of your skull off, and put electrodes all over the brain, all right? Keep those in for 2 or 3 weeks. When you take it out, this is kind of what the brain looks like, right? We've got hematomas all over. They're actually dense, right? The electrodes are it's taking this nice, soft, convoluted surface and putting this big, flat, stiff electrode on top of it, and then putting the skull back and sewing it all back up together. So the neurosurgeon, one of the epilepsy surgeons, Charlie Gurel, all of a sudden this company had come out with this, what they called their microgrid, which is shown here, right? So it's the same size electrodes, they just put them in a smaller package. So that made it even more stiff, right? There's more metal, more thing. And he said, hey, isn't this great? Look at this tiny thing. And I said, that's huge. And why would you use that? He said, well, do you think you can do better? And of course, then I said, of course. And here we go. So thankfully, I had a lot of talented students along the way who helped figure out how do we make something smaller, thinner, more flexible, an implant that was more like the brain, right? And the problem here was that at the time, epilepsy surgery was last resort, right? Because it was this big invasive procedure. We wanted to make it for everyone. Anybody, treat people earlier. All right, so Ji-Won Kim, who's a professor now in Seoul, Korea, came up with this idea, well, let's borrow from the semiconductor flexible circuit technology. And so this is really simple, right? We just take a piece of polyimide insulator, some metal, and another sheet of, and we sandwich them together, and the idea was you have to make this simple, it has to be effective, and it has to be commercialized. So he made a whole bunch of these devices, and then Sunita Thongpang, another of my students, came up with all these different ideas, right? These miniature, these fancy things. You could tie them in knots, you could fold them origami-like, and things like that. And then, but it still wasn't something that the surgeon's like, well, that's not really, still not very useful. And then Amy Sandberg, who will be talking next here, came up with this idea we talk about is, well, what if we just took one of these and we put holes all over it? Because from an engineering standpoint, that makes it more flexible. You can use the same material, you don't have to make it thinner and thinner and thinner and smaller, just put the holes all over the place. So she had this really landmark study where just by taking the device on the right versus the left, and you put it in the brain, and the scar that formed around the one on the left was about a third the size, 30% the size of the one on the right. And this has actually been, we've shown this in now human clinical trials, that is it. Just make it smaller, put less stuff in the brain. It seems so simple. So that led then, again, to the formation of NeuroOne. So Mark Christensen and Dave Rosa and I and Greg Worrell, an epileptologist, started this company a number of years ago. It took a long time because it turns out that these materials, the FDA had never really seen them before. So it took a long time to get this through. And if I went back and did this now, right, this would have gone a lot farther, right? So we started this, Charlie Gurel started this idea back in 2005, and it took almost 15 years to get this off and going. And now we have commercial products, right? So we've got these grids that kind of just look like the ones that are standard. That was important. Give the epileptologist something he already understands, but it's just thinner and more flexible. We put holes in it now, and we've shown now in a number of trials that reduces the immune reaction. We now have ones that don't require a big incision, right? They can kind of be remotely guided. And we can even actually fold them up origami style. So that came back, and we can put them in a catheter and deploy them, and then they fan out. So we've got, I don't know how many, 50 employees now. We've got a whole host of different products. And then thankfully, like most companies, at some point we were running on fumes and had a nice strategic partnership with Zimmer. So they are now our exclusive supplier. And that kind of launched us towards the next timely moment, which was in 2022. We ended up on, just before Thanksgiving, doing our IPO and getting our first FDA approval And it was really great. And this is another one of these huge moments because, I'd recommend it to anyone. It's really a surreal moment to walk out, ring the bell, and then walk out and seeing your face on a 10-story building. It's also really important because if you ever want your kids to think you're cool again, take them to Times Square and put their face on a 10-story building. And one of the reasons why that's really timely is on the way home, the kids are all like, and because we drugged them there, they were like, I don't want to go to New York City. What's this NASDAQ thing, right? And by the end, they're like, Dad, we need to do this again. Can you start another company and do this again? I said, sure, why not? Thankfully, we had, you do get a little bit of momentum, right? You build connections, and it's about people, right? So there's lots of people, because of this, who are interested in saying, hey, let's try to leverage this. Let's see what other kinds of things we could do. So that brings me then to the second company, BrainSync. All right, so BrainSync is built off this idea of maybe we don't have to put things in people's heads. Maybe we can put sensors on the outside of the head and get the kinds of signals we need. We don't always have to do brain surgery. So BrainSync and Neuro1, the fundamental technology started around the same time. So this started back in about 2005. Elizabeth Felton, who was a student that Rob Radwin and I had together, we had a number of papers trying to figure out can you put sensors on the outside and record the electroencephalogram and get the same kind of thing. So we had this kind of big study that came out in 2008, 2009 with my grad student Adam Wilson and my collaborator Gerwin Schalk, figuring out could we help people who had some kind of motor disability, particularly ALS, right? People can't move, they can't communicate, and could we give them a tool that will allow them to send messages to caregivers, to family, things like that, no matter where they were. So we had been working on these algorithms for making emails and things like that just were too clunky. And this was right at the time when Twitter had just come out, and my student Adam and I got together one day where, well, maybe instead of trying to mimic an email, which has all these kind of things, right? You have to select who you want to send it to, you have to type up a subject line or it gets mad at you. Can we just have them broadcast over this new technology called Twitter, right? And it solved all our problems, right? No one on Twitter cares if you spell things right. Actually, they think you're weird if you spell things right, if you spell complete sentences. So he built in all this kind of, what we think of as modern, right? Autocorrection, word prediction, things like that. And I ended up coming with this little program that allowed him to send the first tweet ever. It said "Hello World," which was kind of classic computer scientist thing. So here's a picture of me. We got selected with one of our EEG caps that we use this. We got selected by Time Magazine as one of the best inventions of 2009. And then nothing really happened, right? Because timing wasn't right. There weren't enough people in the world that needed this. And we actually deployed it. So people still use this today to actually communicate. But if you think about the number of people who have ALS or a high spinal cord injury, it's less than 100,000 people in the world, right? So no CEO is ever going to give us money to develop this system to sell to such a small market. Well, so we kind of we kept working on it, but we didn't really ever think that was commercially viable until this guy named Elon Musk came along and started saying, hey, what we need to do is implant people and get them to be able to communicate and send tweets. And so he sent out, and you probably heard about Neuralink, this company that implants people and has them do all kinds of things. So one of the things that he put out last year was that he tweeted that their first human subject was the first person ever to post a tweet just by thinking, which I thought, well, no, but but let's not worry about facts, right? Anyway, it got people really interested though, right? So people started going, hey, what is going on with that technology we're developing? Has it gone anywhere? Well, it turned out we actually had been working on it. We were just working on it for something that was much larger market. And so BrainSync, I founded last year, right around because people were really interested in kind of what could we commercialize? But we've been working on, for the last decade, this idea that instead of helping people who were disabled, who had no ability to move, right, could we help people who had limited ability, particularly people who had stroke? So BrainSync is founded around this idea that say you have a unilateral stroke, right? You've got an injury on one side, which is very common, and I can move my left arm, but I can't move my right arm, right? Well, we can record the activity from then both sides of the brain, right? You can record from the side that moves normally, the one that doesn't, and we can compare those signals, and then we can start to guess, right? That's what, essentially, this is a machine learning algorithm that guesses when you're thinking about moving. And then we have this little exoskeleton that has neural stimulators that will actually stimulate the nerves in your arm and move it for you. So pretty simple. What's really cool is that it turns out, so we started this project with Vivek Prabhakaran, now with Remzik, who's a BME student, and the idea was that all we're doing is doing what a physical therapist does anyway. So a physical therapist, if you have a stroke, will say, hey, I'm going to cue you to move your arm. You say, all right, move your arm, and I'm going to move it for you. And if you do that over and over and over, you can actually retrain the brain. We have all these latent pathways that we're born with that we don't use, and we can actually go around the injury and form new pathways. We can bypass the injury with our computer program and retrain the brain to be able to do that. And after 6 weeks or so of therapy, we can see not only do we get changes in brain activity, so on the left is post-stroke, and then this is after 6 weeks, we see actually increased activity both on the side of the brain that's normal, that is, we actually think we're recruiting some of that activity to help, as well as increased activity on the stroke side as well. And then the clinical measures are out too, right? Clinically relevant and impactful changes in ARAT scores, as well as grip strength in the affected. So last year with Jeff Erb, who was ex-Medtronic, it was actually someone we met through some of our other companies, started this, and we raised enough money where we've just finished up a clinical trial with about 50 participants in that. All right, so I think I'm still almost on time. So lessons learned, that was one of the things. So hopefully what you got out of this were a couple things. And I think these are probably some things that Dave and I are both going to talk about, right? Key to doing this is knowing your market, right, and finding the right market. Some of the early ones where, we didn't understand the market, or we were trying to put a round peg in a square hole. As engineers, sometimes we really want to make this fancy device and have it, work with everything. So instead, I always think about start with the end in mind, right? What is the clinician need? What does the patient need? And let's work backwards and figure out what the appropriate technologies, figure out what materials we should use that the FDA would really like, rather than fighting with them and trying to push things through. So we've gotten much, much better at that just from kind of those two lessons. Hopefully you've seen timing is crucial, right? These events, have come, seemingly serendipitous because you were ready for it, right? Always be ready for when that opportunity comes. And keeping it simple, right? In both cases, it was like, let's just make something a little bit better. Let's try to replicate what people are already doing, make it easy for the person who's going to use it. And then the last one, I think this is universally, working with good people, right? The number of people I've met through starting these companies in academia, have just led to more things, right? Multiple companies are with the same people, because once you find a good group of people, it becomes really easy. So I'll turn it over to Dave and take his spot down at the end.
What I use to advance? Yeah. So while I'm waiting for the slides, oh, there we go. Sitting here this morning listening to everything, I realized I could spend my whole time just telling more stories very easily. Also, there's some common themes I didn't know about that connected me with other people. So I was raised on a farm, as Justin was. I think that's not a coincidence that people who are raised on farms are inherently entrepreneurial. And I also had forgotten that, like John and Willis, I worked in industry before I came back to graduate school, which I also think is, in an ideal world, would be required of all professors. I'm gonna, how much time, are we on time? How much time do I have? 10 minutes, okay. So I'm gonna spend most of my time on the first slide because I really wanna highlight the role of BME in this. And I realized also that I'm a very different kind of entrepreneur than Justin is, and that's not a good or bad thing. It's just the entrepreneurs come in all sorts of flavors. While Justin sort of worked on one thing through all of his companies, same theme, I am the type of person that gets bored really, really quickly. So I've gone in a whole bunch of different directions. As I mentioned, I was raised on a farm. I actually went to UW-Platteville initially and then transferred to Madison, worked for Kimberly-Clark, then came back to grad school where John Webster was my master's advisor and Denise Denton was my PhD advisor. And then I went off to Louisiana Tech for a few years and then Champaign-Urbana, and it was in Champaign where I first got this entrepreneurial bug. And had a student there, Ian Glasgow, who was interested in starting a company. So I said, why not? So we did. I'm not going to focus on that company today. That company was not the right company at the right time, as Justin alluded to. We learned a lot. Got to stay at a billionaire's house once, had a lot of interesting stories. This was back in the days of cloning dogs, and we actually got to stay in Sperling's house because we were working on, they were interested in using our technology to clone his dog. But we actually made the decision that we were not the right time, right technology. And we actually sold our IP off to a venture-backed company out of Michigan, actually. And about 3 years later, they closed shop as well. So a successful shutdown, I would say. We made the decision. Nobody's made any money in this space to date. But one of the BME undergrads then that actually worked for that company for a while was Ben Moga. And so he was, I was just talking to John and Tracy, and he was a couple of years later than John and Tracy, but one of the early BME students. And I still remember Ben in my instrumentation class as a sophomore, because he was a smart ass. and he was really smart too. But he'd always sit in the back of the classroom and just, he was a really smart guy, but he was not afraid of speaking his mind. And so he would often speak up or ask questions. But that sort of makes you take notice of someone, right? When they have that confidence. And so he actually ended up then becoming involved in another company that we started a few years later on drug delivery. And this was a partnership with some folks from the med school, actually, and some technology that we had developed in the lab, and Ben came on board. About the same time, we started a company, which I'm going to get into a little bit more in this talk, which was called Salus, which I now have another company I'm going to talk about today that we renamed. We took that name because I liked it, and it means well-being in Greek. Latin. And anyway, Salus only was for about a year. It merged with Bellbrook Labs, which is still a going company here in Madison. And Ivar Meyvanson, an Icelandic BME graduate student, helped start that first Salus company. About the same time, and this is the story, I'll take one slide to tell a little bit about this. We started a company with Scott Berry, who was the co-founder, who was a postdoc at the time, on sample prep. How do you get something out of a blood sample, for example? And then a few years later, Ben Cassavat and Erwin Berthier, they're both PhD BME students in the lab, actually they didn't know what they wanted to do. And this is what I think I love about Wisconsin. It's a very independent entrepreneurial space. And so because they had seen me start some companies, they'd seen other students start companies, and because WARF is here and their influence across campus, and because this is just a very grassroots sort of university where people are encouraged to start from the bottom and innovate from the bottom, not be told what to do from the top, they just decided we want to start a company. And they didn't even know what they were going to start it on. and they said, well, you know, one problem, wouldn't it be cool if we could take blood from an arm painlessly? And so they took that idea. I think they attended the entrepreneurial boot camp and they came up with ideas. I'm actually not going to tell that story today. It's a long story. They raised $100 million a couple of years ago. They have an FDA-approved product. Still don't know whether they're going to be successful or not. That's how these things work. But they were so ingrained in the Wisconsin culture that tasso, you may not know what that means, but it's badger in Portuguese. So they're in Seattle. They moved to Seattle a number of years ago. Ben Moga actually, Ratio then shut down. To this day, nobody has produced, at the time there were probably half a dozen or a dozen product companies trying to do autonomous drug delivery. None of them were successful. So that was, you know, another learning experience. Ben Moga then moved to Tasso, helped them get started. And then about that same time, I started a company called Salus Discovery in town here, which has been around for now 11 years. And it's an R&D company that never intends to launch a product. Our model is to originally we took licensed patents from Orf and continued to develop them to the point where we could then license them off to other companies. Salus now has its own fairly comprehensive patent portfolio, and we've had quite a bit of success now licensing this to other companies, and I'll tell you a brief snippet of that. Unfortunately, in that way of doing business, it's almost all confidential, so I can't actually tell you about most of what that company does. And then just Ivar's actually moved back to Iceland. He's running a company there now. Two other undergrads, John Guckenberger and Hannah Pisa, were instrumental in the early days of Salus as well. They're both in the Bay Area working for startups and established companies there. Jay Warwick, a PhD student from my lab, now runs R&D at Salus. Started another company a few years ago with a couple other folks from the lab. Teddy, and then the other company I do want to mention a little bit more detail is Lynx Bio, and I have a slide on that, and that was started a few years ago, and it's in San Diego now, and I'll talk a little more about that. So, and then I think to Bill's comment, over the pandemic, we actually started another company and got a large contract from the Warp Speed program actually to work on COVID. And a couple of months ago, I started a really interesting company, co-founded a company in Milwaukee on microbiome. So you can see I go all over the place. But that's because of the culture here, right? The things that you heard earlier in earlier talks about the collaborative nature of this campus and of BME as a discipline. That's what really encouraged me to not be limited to one thing, but to reach out into different areas. And we're actually going to be starting another company in a few weeks. So I won't reiterate these lessons, but I just want to give two little one-slide vignettes, or two slides on Salus, one on Lynx. So again, highlighting what the students did and some of the aspects of what it takes to get a product out there. So in 2001, right after I moved to Wisconsin as a faculty member, we had I don't know if that video will play if I press the button. No, it won't, but that's okay. So we had this science paper that we thought we were the greatest people in the world. This was our first science paper, and we'd created this way to make what we called virtual walls. So long story short, 10 years later, we finally found a useful idea product idea that was based on that science paper. And I would say that's pretty true uniformly. The high-profile papers are rarely the papers that have something that actually is useful in the real world. And in fact, that original patent ended up not being very important commercially. What it ended up spawning, though, is solutions to this problem of sample prep. So if you have a complex sample of blood or plants or cell lysates, what had happened in the world at that point is that nobody really cared about sample prep up until 10 years ago because the downstream processes were so expensive and so low throughput it didn't matter. But now mass spec, PCR, sequencing, it's all really cheap. So now industry actually cares about the front end. And so we were sort of in the right place at the right time in 2010-ish to start thinking about this. And we developed some clever ways with a bunch of students that were involved in a number of these patents to be able to do really simple sample prep in a single step that was better performing than a traditional sample prep process. And I don't think this video is going to play either, but in 2016 launched the first product in collaboration with Gilson. And variations of this have now been licensed into a number of other companies. Oh, I guess it is going to play. So this is in classic Gilson terminology, they call it the extract man. And what it allows you to do is, in a high throughput way, do an extraction process that uses magnetic beads and actually outperforms a multi-step existing extraction process, traditional extraction process. So Salus has actually continued to innovate and, like I say, does a bunch of different things in sample prep and diagnostics. I did want to mention one of the impacts I think that the entrepreneurship this campus has. It's really an extension, certainly Salus has been an extension of the BME design program, because we've hired at least a dozen BME undergrads as hourlies, and their training in the design program has really been instrumental because they come right in, they know what to do, they know how to do things at the bench. I want to just tell one other vignette because it taught me a lesson. And so a number of years ago, about 10 years ago, we were collaborating with Shigeki Miyamoto, a cancer biologist. And again, because this is a short talk, I'm not going to get into any of the technical details. But what we ended up running some experiments, taking a blood sample, a bone marrow aspirate from multiple myeloma patients. And we ran these experiments that showed that we could predict if this patient was going to respond to a certain drug or not. It's pretty exciting. Got the cover article in a journal article, and we knew it had some commercial potential, but at the time I was already somewhat of an experienced entrepreneur, and I knew that it would be a long haul to get a product like that out. It was, and this was not enough. But Jerome Pack, who was a postdoc a grad student in Shigeki's lab and then came and did a postdoc in my lab for about a year, she came to me and said, no, I really am passionate about this. I think it can matter. I want to start a company. And I knew her quite well at this point, and I said, actually my first reaction in my brain was, you're crazy, right? Because she was completely naive, knew nothing about starting a company, right? But she'd seen some other people in the lab do it. But then I paused for a moment. I said, as Justin mentioned, it's about the people. And she was also passionate and very persistent. And I said, I'm not going to bet against this person. Because my initial thought was, no, I'm not going to get involved in this. And then I said, no, I'm not going to bet against her. Because she is not going to give up. And so I then offered to help her get that started, served on their board for the first few years, because this data really opened up the door to the possibility of a new kind of companion diagnostics, where you can take a sample and actually determine treatment. So she has now moved the company to San Diego. They're in La Jolla, up on the Mesa, next to Scripps and UCSD. And while they haven't made it yet, they have a number of contracts with pharma. They are actually doing quite well. It's been a struggle, and she's had to learn a lot along the way because she was so naive, but she's making it, and it's been really, really fun and rewarding to see people like that in the environment that this university provides to launch these sorts of efforts. So the lesson here is don't bet against persistence and passion. So I'm going to help keep us on time, and I'll sum up. So things that I've learned is if I had to do it all over, if most of us, our goal is not just to make money. If that had been the goal, I now know diagnostics is not the place to do it. It's a really hard place to do business. One of my favorite things I like to say, the snazziness of a startup's website is often inversely proportional to the success they're having. And I found that to be fairly universally true. Often, if you're actually having success, you don't have time to worry about a fancy website. Taking on investors, I've done companies in a variety of ways, from venture capital to my own money. And I would say taking on investors is often, usually, the start of the end of rational decision making. I see a lot of experienced people out there nodding their heads. As Justin highlighted, timing can be everything, and it often is. The first 2 companies I started, no company has had any success in those spaces. It just wasn't the right time, wasn't the right? With experience, which is the next bullet, you start to be able to recognize that better. So experience is really important, unless you're extremely lucky. And one thing I always like to highlight that's so fundamentally different in my mind between academia and industry, and again, it's something that I think our BME department with the design program really helps bridge that gap, is that in industry, there's no substitute for experience. Every company is different. Every deal you do is different. Every negotiation is different. And until you build up some experience, it doesn't matter how smart you are. It's not a substitute. That's different than academia, right? We have these brilliant new young faculty starting, and if you're really smart, you'll be successful in academia. You will. But that doesn't necessarily directly translate to industry. And work with good people, right? It's something I've learned over the years. For me, that's a big threshold, right? I'm not going to start doing something with people that I don't enjoy and people that I have to have confidence that they are ethical people who are going to make decisions in the right way. And finally, enjoy the process, because you're going to have more failures than successes typically. So it needs to be fun along the way. Have compassion, take the time to mentor people and make them the next generation. And these are just some of the former students that I've had that have been involved in companies that I've started or they've started on their own. And that's one of the most enjoyable things, certainly at this point in my career, to be able to look back and see all these folks being successful and being good people who are contributing to trying to improve human health across the board. So with that, I will stop and we'll move on to the next stage. Thank you.
Do you have any questions? This is a good opportunity to ask.
When you know it's time to quit, right? It takes time to grab your students or holidays, or run an experiment. Oh, I wasn't sad, or oh, what about this week? And that it was very clear based on your talk. You're like, this isn't working. And I'm curious, kind of like after that. Was it that feeling? Was it someone you're gonna have? Like, it probably is a plethora of things, but I would love to hear your insight on it. When you knew it was like, okay, let's shelve this, let's stop.
Yes, the question is sort of how do you know when to quit? And it is a journey, right? So the first couple were, well, the first one actually, we realized that there were biological limitations. So that one actually was interesting because we actually realized that probably nobody was ever going to do this successfully because of some of the data we had. Because it's a business where we were successful in still selling off our IP to somebody who didn't understand that. And they tried some more, and we weren't sure, but we made that decision very consciously to stop. The second one was just, we ran out of money. Typical. But now, and that's why I talk about the experience, because now I make that decision much earlier. Because with the experience, I'm much better able to ask the right questions, right? Not that I'm always going to be right, but odds are better that I will be right, so that I don't waste time on efforts. It's almost gotten to be a problem for me, I would say. And like I go to academic conferences and lectures now, and I just walk through the lecture session and I go, I'll never be anything useful. Because once you've been through it, you can see, you know the path, and you can see all the reasons that are, may have nothing to do with the technology, but there's just no way to get through the process of the problem.
Any other questions?
One for Dave, because you mentioned your broad interest in wanting to go this direction, and that when you have interests like that, you're not going down one pathway, but how do you, when you're trying to be at the top of your field, how do you balance making sure you know enough to chase those different directions and not be naive, so to say, diving into different directions?
I think that's one of my superpowers. Is I don't care if I'm naive. And it goes back to the story I told to John Hutch. I mean, that was something I certainly learned growing up on the farm, but it's also something that was supported and reinforced by mentors like John Webster, who don't worry about that. You know, if it's something you're interested in and you think you have something to offer, just charge through. For me personally, that's what keeps it fun. That's the part I love. But that's not for everyone. You know, other people will work on it. And we need the spectrum, right? We need people who are very, very deep in one area, and you know that. So it's a spectrum. We can all fit.
Go on, last. Go ahead.
I have a question. Just in your experiences, starting all these companies, what's the best way that you have found in or key in identifying a gap that you can kind of look towards to start a company, or to have IP that is valuable in a certain market?
Yeah, I think what I showed there is go to the people who are going to use things, right? Hang out with the people who don't sit in your silo and I want this technology, I think it's really great, and then try to shop it around. Learn early on that I tried that. People looked at me like, oh, that's great. I can never use that because of these obvious limitations that I just hung around them. I would have realized. And so, I spend most of my time just interacting with people, right? Listening to, not trying to shop what I've got, listening to what their problems are, and then trying to figure out, okay, is there new technology that needs to be developed for that? Or do I have something sitting on the shelf? And that's happening. That I made for a completely different reason, but could I actually solve their problem? I think Dave had some examples of that too.
Okay, let's thank the speakers.